Dru Oja Jay has appeared on the podcast before to discuss his writing. He's an author, organizer, and web developer who currently serves as executive director of CUTV and publisher of The Breach. He's also a co-founder of the Media Co-op and Friends of Public Services. He wrote a book with Nikolas Barry-Shaw called Paved with Good Intentions, Canada's Development NGOs from Idealism to Imperialism. We talk about that book in our previous episode, so have a listen if you're curious. James Steinhoff is an assistant professor and Astra fellow in the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. His research focuses on the political economy of algorithmic technologies, data, and digital labor. We talk about his stunning, insightful book, Automation and Autonomy, Labor, Capital, and Machines in the Artificial Intelligence Industry, which is chock full of information about the history of AI and its relationship to capitalist modes of production. I should note too that he co-authored a book called Inhuman Power, Artificial Intelligence, and the Future of Capitalism in 2019, which is also a great book on AI. So it feels as though every other day we encounter a new angle or emerging fact around machine learning, generative AI, and the incipient market for these sorts of data-driven digital products. Whether it's the billions of investment dollars that are driving the sudden boom in startups focusing on applications of generative AI, concerns about automation and job loss, concerns about plagiarism and the saturation achieved by ChatGPT, or important discussions about the exploited labor force that actually fuels ChatGPT's core functions. Like an army of US contractors are being paid about $15 per hour to perform the work of data labeling that drives that platform. We're inundated by information about this supposedly revolutionary technology, and that inundation is fueling the hype cycle, further driving up investment. Here we talk about the goals of the capitalist class in determining the future of AI. What will the fragmentation of the labor force look like in the wake of this technological change? Are large language models going to replace human communicators? Does this signal a lasting shift in the market for intellectual labor? What about all of the data that's collected to drive the creation of those large language models? Can we imagine ways to produce machine learning outside of that massive corporate capture of our data? Whose data is it, anyway? There are lots of changes coming, there's no question, but the question too few of us are asking is, who will be in command of that change? In the EU, there's the AI Act, which Steinhoff calls a watershed moment in the regulation of private business and its enclosure of AI technology. Jay reminds us that when it comes to the potential for public and democratic control of data, even though it seems like an unfair fight, we still have to, quote, start building power somewhere. We also dig into fictional representations of AI. We ponder what movies like Terminator 2 Judgment Day get right in terms of AI generating its own programs, generating, as it were, its own ideas about function. Or, as James puts it, creating a situation where the program is the output rather than the input. Steinhoff and Jay share some insights on potential avenues of resistance too, not just resistance in the classical political sense, but also a kind of imaginative or intellectual resistance where the public shies away from falling for the hype. They discuss their research into the history of AI and unpack these moments of AI winter or AI depression, where social and technological barriers basically shut down the hype cycle. They demystify machine learning and also talk about some of the basic elements of AI-generated art and text. The reason why we're here is, of course, to talk about, not just AI broadly, but like open AI in particular, which this company has left a huge mark on the kind of collective imagination, it feels like, at least for the time being, with ChatGPT. So, James, you wrote an article recently for Truth Out where you talk about this. You say that, quote, OpenAI is a leader in the form of artificial intelligence known as large language models, and that a large language model is a statistical model of a language created by machine learning. So you don't spend a ton of time in the article explaining what that means, but you have written more broadly about the nature of these acts of algorithmic manipulation, to use your term. This moment, though, does feel significant, at least in terms of like collective awareness of the material possibilities that ChatGPT represents. And you suggest, like in the article, that maybe ChatGPT does seem to at least teach us something. So to again quote the piece, you say, it teaches something about how human cognition works and the differences and similarities between how humans and machines process information. So I wanted to start by just asking you to, if you could, expand on what a large language model is, like its literal scale, and how the chatbot in some ways is teaching us about human cognition.
Yeah, absolutely. I will note that in the article I did say that it will. I was speaking in the future tense
Right.
there, more about what exactly differences it may reveal down the road. I don't want to say that it is working like a human brain, because it's not, as far
Hmm.
as I know. But yeah, so what large language models are basically, yeah, they're a statistical representation of a language. Uh, so basically, in terms of the statistical likelihood of particular characters existing in a certain sequence or not, right? That's really what they are. So they
Hmm.
are are not trained on grammatical rules. They're not, built by linguists who have a certain theoretical understanding of a language. They are just essentially, patterns extracted from large, huge data sets. The actual scale of ChatGPT's data set, I don't think, has been disclosed, because they don't really want to say exactly what it's been trained on. But
Mm.
earlier large language models um, have, I think, have been disclosed. And, the entirety of English language Wikipedia represents only a small fraction of what these would be trained on, for instance. And
Mm.
Wikipedia is quite a large data set on its own.
Hmm.
So the scale is truly massive, right? You can think like, I believe Reddit is one of the inputs on Chat GPT. So all Reddit posts that exist,
Lord.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and whatever other forums that exist or on the internet.
Mm.
So the scale's big, yeah. Whatever they can get from Google Books, I imagine. Yeah, I mean, who knows? We will only find out down the road, perhaps.
That's intense.
Yes, I mean, they're big. That's what we can say. Um,
Sure.
yeah, one of the things I think that's interesting about these is that they are performing sophisticated linguistic output without being trained to do so, without being told how to do so. I mean, right? This
Hmm.
this is the interesting thing about the machine learning paradigm in general, is that the program is the output rather than the input, right? Traditional programming, you combine data with a program to get an output. In machine learning, you combine data with a learning algorithm to produce the program as the output. And so that's, rather than build a program step by step, rather than build a program that can produce linguistic output, with large language models, you have a learning algorithm extract a pattern from the training data, and that's the machine learning model that is a program on its own, which no one had to program explicitly on how to do this stuff. It just has emergent properties.
Sure. I mean, I'm fascinated to like hear more about this idea of like emerging properties or emergent properties, the kind of the program sort of taking over and the generative qualities of it, and it's something that definitely you're kind of speculating on in your book, automation and autonomy in terms of like the emergence of even the automation of automation, where like the algorithms begin to be written by algorithms, which is
Yeah.
like feels like some science fiction shit. But I wanted to ask you, Dru, about one of the things you talk about in your article for the Breach on AI, which is the kind of hype, right? This feeling of like being, swept up in the hype around AI. And like the thing that you're saying is that the element of hype has always been part of the market for commodities based on artificial intelligence. The way you put it is that the hype method is something deployed repeatedly by Silicon Valley. And it should be said, not just in the field of AI. Like there's a sort of network that you map where you're describing to quote the article, a sophisticated infrastructure built around the tech press and its symbiotic relationship with venture capital. Do you feel like that part of the narrative is sort of being left out a little bit? This effort to build enough hype that you garner enough money to actually produce some of these sophisticated AI-driven, like technological commodities?
I think the people generating the narrative, are the narrative, and so it's hard to know that you are the narrative when you're inside it, I guess. Mm-hmm. In the sense that we get most of our information, via journalists and so on. But yeah, I mean, Silicon Valley talks unabashedly. Even, I mentioned in the article that critics call it the hype cycle, but proponents call it that too. Like, mm-hmm. I think they understand that you need to enter a hype cycle in order to build up an investment bubble, which gives you the sort of ability to hire big staffs, to like hire lobbyists to do all the marketing. And so you've seen this kind of go through a few different phases. Certainly Airbnb, Uber, like have gone through this, have done this sort of hype cycle phase where they're like, you build up a critical mass of sort of press coverage and discourse about what you're doing, and that gets you sort of market penetration, and then that gets you investment, which then lets you do things like, with Uber, like the reason people liked Uber initially is because they paid well, and they were provided a better service than taxi cabs. The pay well part is quickly dropping off a cliff, and that was always part of the plan. Like the paying well was just an upfront capital allocation in order to get the market share and somewhere close to a monopoly, so that you can keep your sort of global market dominance machine running. And of course that generates more investment, which creates a loop, right? So we're seeing that with AI, and it's really interesting. I mean, if you look at Sam Altman's statements recently, on the one hand, he's talking about ChatGPT 4, which is the next version, which is coming out, and he's like actively lowering people's expectations about that. He's like, it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. But at the same time, he's saying things like to the New York Times, like, we're going to create the successor species to humanity. We're going to create general intelligence that's going to be able to take over every task that humans do, and will basically exist in this world of like pure leisure where we only do things that we want to do. Right. Like, and so the hype, that's the hype, right? That's his contribution to the hype cycle, where he's saying these things that are just these absurd projections into the future of AI. Like, somebody described the hype cycle as drawing a straight line from an actual accomplishment to some kind of unbounded future. And I think that's basically what he does. But at the same time, he's lowering expectations for what's coming up. So which one's true, right? Like, they're both true, because they each have a different function. One is to have like an actual product that doesn't fall short of expectations. So that's one function. And then the other function is to generate this sort of limitless capital allocation that comes from not just from Microsoft, but like from investors at large that are pouring billions and billions of dollars into AI on the premise that it's going to do these things. And of course, he's talking in a public relations way, but I think passing through the filter of like the business press and the investor mindset, what investors see is the ability to make a lot of money by automating processes and disrupting industries and effectively removing livelihoods, taking them off the table. Or at the very least, the hype cycle becomes its own sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, because basically what happens is that when you allocate capital somewhere, you don't allocate it somewhere else. And so if the future of medicine is AI, or if the future of manufacturing is AI, then you're not going to invest in human-based manufacturing, even if the AI thing is just based on like totally vaporware promises. Like, you're going to move investment into that. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the billions are going to not building like a factory based on what we know works. It'll be based on investing in this giant capital, which then has to have a return. And so create a whole political, once you have billions of dollars sitting somewhere, like a chunk of that goes to lobbying, goes to like pressuring and hyping and doing all these things. So it creates this. It gathers its own momentum, even if it's not based in reality. That's not the point. The point is to get political power, to get financial power, and concentrate it in a particular sort of technological corporate nexus.
Yeah, absolutely. And like both of you really lay bare in your writing how, to quote James's work, like automation means the increasing autonomy of capital from labor. Like you're both boiling things down to the question of labor. But I wanted to pick up on something you were saying, Drew, about like this straight line, because it's not been a straight line. Like that's one of the things that I've learned from doing this sort of research is that there's been cycles of hype, but there have also been what James calls these kind of troughs of disappointment. The narrative of just like a steady uptick toward a moment of kind of technological singularity that's going to free us all from the toil of work is false, and it obscures more than it reveals. And so, yeah, like James, I wondered if you could like unpack this idea that like it's not just about the centrality of hype for AI research. It's also about these troughs of disappointment, this kind of up and down. And in particular, like if you could explain what the various points of AI winter have been historically, like why did those lulls happen?
Sure. Yeah, and I agree with Drew's point on hype there. And it's an interesting fact about that, like, industry around hype. It's not just the tech communities themselves. It's like, I think the consulting firm Gartner is one that sort of brought the tech hype cycle thing to the mainstream. And they do a, I don't know, yearly or whatever. They sort of chart different emerging technologies on a hype cycle. But they are one of the major contributors to the hype around new technologies, which is really funny. I don't think they acknowledge that in their tracking, but they're like Accenture, and that they put out these very hype-filled reports on new technology with zero critical thinking in them. But yeah, so AI winters and hype. So yeah, there have been two historical AI winters. It's generally held, and the first one would have been around the first wave of AI, the so-called symbolic or old-fashioned AI now, like some people call it, which is the non-machine learning paradigm, the other historical paradigm to AI, where you build a system of more or less heuristic rules that acts in a sort of high-level logical way, processing symbols in a way comparable to a formal logic system or something, as opposed to machine learning. Yeah, and around to the end of the 70s or so, this approach was recognized had some pretty severe limitations. And in the 80s and 90s, it was attempted to commercialize this technique with something called expert systems, which are these systems of rules where people would try to literally capture the expert knowledge of workers in a system that could then be queried by unexperienced people or management, basically to just capture expert knowledge of workers in a
Mm-hmm.
literal digital Taylorism, if you will. And this had limited success in some limited, constricted domains. But then it was realized that this couldn't work when beyond simple, smaller domains, because you literally have to put in a rule about every possible thing that could happen, right? So if you're not working
Mm-hmm.
with a very constrained domain, this system couldn't work, and that sort of, led to a big moment of AI depression, if you will, when it was realized, wow, the maintenance and the upkeep on a system like this is infinite, because you have to add new rules to account for any new system or any new change that happens, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
you're monitoring traffic and suddenly people have a traffic control AI, but then suddenly people start using electric scooters and those aren't accounted for in your system, then you have to build in a whole new set of rules for how to process those, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big failure then. But then machine learning arose, to automate the production of systems. And of course, then there was another lull when it was also realized, we don't know how to scale up machine learning either. And that
Mm-hmm.
happened in, let's say, the 90s or early 2000s. And then that sort of winter only ended in the 2010s, when the so-called deep learning paradigm happened, basically when people realized, oh, what we needed was data. And now with the digitization of everything on the internet, we have data. And so that ended, let's say, the recurring winters with the latest, well, whatever season we are now. I don't know, spring, summer, fall.
Mm-hmm. Hard to say, yeah. And to kind of build from that, I was wondering about like just the question of kind of definitions here, right? Because like the season we're in is partly determined by the terms in a way, like how we actually name these things. I think has itself a generative effect. So like ChatGPT is just one example of what's sometimes called generative AI. And I'm wondering about what this type of software does specifically, like why it's important for the spring of AI that we're in. Are there other examples that people would be familiar with of generative AI? And I ask that really because I think it might make sense to just take a step back and like offer listeners some basic definitions. I know, Dru, for example, in your article, you talk about how, quote, AI derives its power to automate, manipulate, predict, and innovate from collecting these vast quantities of data, from concentrating massive computing power and surrounding it with human trainers. But that form of AI is what we now call machine learning. Is that different from generative AI? How can we like tease these things apart, and is it useful to do that work?
Generative AI is a kind of machine learning.
Okay.
So machine learning is a general approach to AI, and generally you can think of typical machine learning applications as performing a function of classification or of clustering, which just means grouping things by similarity, if not categories.
Mm,
And that very simplistic sounding two functions, that's what most machine learning does. Generative AI, instead of classifying a data point or clustering data points like that, it produces a data point. It produces some sort of output. So that's the difference.
gotcha. Are there other examples of this? Like I know it's not just Chat GPT. Like the one thing I was wondering about is just the the rise and fall of DALI, this particular form of generative AI that got garnered all kinds of headlines as a thing that was going to potentially displace the creative labor of artists. Why do you think the hype around that seems to have faded? Is it just that Chat GPT is the new thing for the 24-hour news cycle to kind of zero in on? Or is there something banal about the kinds of art that DALI was making that people are starting to sort of come to terms with? Like, any thoughts on that specific example of like AI generated art and our relationship to it?
I haven't been following that super closely, but I feel like there's a novelty factor that sort of plays in here. I mean, obviously, when Dolly and was it the other one, Midjourney, different image generators came out. Obviously, a lot of people find it fun to play with them.
Yeah.
And so I think you saw it sort of generated its own meme round to borrow a term from cryptocurrency hype cycles. But yeah, I think ChatGPT obviously has more far-reaching practical applications that I think are being that I think go a little deeper in their implications. But that said, you get that after the initial burst of hype with the image generators, you do get sort of more specialized things that can actually start to have impact on people's livelihoods, which isn't to say that you're going to see that in the hype. That's where the actual capital goes to allocate, because it wants a return, right? So if you can create a service that people can sign up for $75 a month, that takes away some percentage of the time spent on illustration or design or something like that. The genius of the algorithm is that these sort of glorified autocomplete sort of models is that they change things a little bit enough to make it look like it's original, but it really is just based on text that other people have generated. So, but it looks different enough that you can't sort of claim copyright infringement, because mimicking isn't copyright infringement, stylistically.
Right.
I think people jump from, AI is useless to AI is going to replace graphic designers. I don't think either of those things are true, but it can certainly turn graphic designers into more of a curation or editing or supervision type of role. Progressively. Obviously, it's right now it's just a tool that maybe like cuts a few corners, but and there's a dystopian version of that where companies don't want to pay people for hours that they're not working, and so the benefits to graphic designers or to artists, isn't really there. It just means that they're going to have to do more automation facing and soulless work to make a living, right? And I think that's the case everywhere, but certainly that seems to be the sort of track we're going down with image generation, is that just like with the BuzzFeed thing, like you're supervising a machine, you're providing sort of adult supervision more and more instead of doing the actual clicking and creative generation and stuff like that. And I think obviously that's good for the bottom line of whatever company is relying on that, but it's also going to create feedback loops where AI generated stuff is going to start to once everyone has it, then you're going to have to find ways to set yourself apart from the crowd in a marketing term. So that's going to create that's going to have significant impacts on the aesthetics, I think, and what people see as being professionally designed, or what people see as being a nice looking website or poster. Like that's going to shift significantly, and you're going to see things, because that's often based on sort of scarcity or uniqueness or authenticity. I think you're going to see those things become more prized, at least at the high end. But at the low end, it's just going to have negative effects on workers, I think.
Yeah, I think there's two historical precedents or episodes that are interesting to think about in the terms of the image AI. And one is photography, because the same exact panic occurred around the advent of photography, right? It's going to destroy painting. And it's very similar to the discourse going on around these AI models, right? And not to say that they won't have effects at all. Like I agree with Dru totally on that. But it seems likely down the road, photography didn't annihilate painting, and so the effect will be more complex and convoluted than mere annihilation, as some people are worried about. And the second thing I think is interesting to think about is, in terms of job roles and fragmentation, automation of work, is the role that existed in the early internet of the webmaster, right? If you remember this, it was like a multi-skill person who would basically do all of the different tasks that are required to create and maintain a website in the early internet. And that role doesn't really exist anymore, through a combination of just applications that have automated functionality built in, or certain things becoming more or less common knowledge, or platforms just doing them automatically. You no longer have that job role. And I'm just, as Dru was talking, thinking about that in the context of graphic design or something, fragmentation, and how exactly that plays out. I don't know, but I can see something like that happening. And I agree that I think in the long term, the language models are going to have more significant effects than the image ones, because they're rudimentary now only, and they will likely increase in sophistication.
So on the one hand, there's this like apocalyptic sense that we're going to have particular people rendered like disposable by AI. But then that sort of that kind of gloomy rhetoric of AI producing this dystopian future, which we see so often in narrative and in film and fiction, is sort of offset by the kind of radical techno-utopianism of big tech and so on. And I feel like in the middle, you do have some theorists on the left in particular that are trying to imagine a world in which we don't need to be so pessimistic about technology, because technology as such has been sort of like liberated in some ways. And there's this moment, James, in your book where you make the point that, in a sense, the trajectory of OpenAI quote, sums up the difficulties of AI research and development beyond the reach of capital. And like, I guess one way of asking it is just like, is there such a thing as AI research and development that exists outside the reach of capital? I mean, does the story of DeepMind and its acquisition by Google, like this is a company that wasn't making products per se, sort of point to this problem of AI only being experimented with inside the confines or the dictates of the free market, with its overwhelming emphasis on like competition, profit generation? I guess, so that's one way of asking it, if there is such a thing. But then also, like, what do you think a form of AI that wasn't created within these market constraints, what do you think that would act and look and feel and perform like? There is this sort of idea of left accelerationism, right? Do you think like the left is a bit too pessimistic about technology? Is that pessimism founded? Like, can we convincingly articulate what a non-market development of AI technology could produce?
Admittedly, I'm quite pessimistic about this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Machine learning as it exists currently requires an infrastructure of surveillance, tons of data
Right.
collected through surveillance, and very, very, very powerful computational hardware that's energy intensive. So by definition right now, it has to be centralized, or it's only available to people with a lot of money to invest. So in the current paradigm, you can do cooperative experiments, data co-ops. You can try making it less intense and capable of running on the edge, as they call it, rather than the cloud, where all the computation is done. The clouds are owned by the big tech companies. You could try to make some of it run on the actual device. It's called edge computing, and that might give some more autonomy from the cloud. But the question of the surveillance via data is one of the other big questions, right? If you've read any book like Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism or something, the access to the data that the AI producers have it's not a coincidence that they also own social networks, right? Or search engines, and they're in the positions for appropriating this data, which they were doing secretly until it was sort of brought out, and it continues to occur. Where would this data come from in a left socialist economy or something? Is everyone going to be okay with the surveillance? Do you still want your text to be mined and to still have that information being given to the commissariat or whatever? That's one of the big functional questions there, and it's not as amenable to small local initiatives. It's hard to have a commune of data because the power of many of these technologies, like large language models, comes from their huge scale. It doesn't arise on a small scale. You don't have small language models for that reason.
Sure.
There's some there's an interesting point that you made about sort of apocalypse. I think it's just worth a brief detour, but just even when you're talking about journalists or graphic designers, I feel like there's almost a way in which we sort of unconsciously desire the sort of like clean slate of the apocalypse. Like I feel like that's part of the fascination with like zombie movies is not even so much the zombies as the just emptiness and the like starting over. And I feel like that's almost like, I feel like for a lot of people, like just a relief than like going on in this like horrible corrupt system that is like destroying the planet. Like if it's already happened, then we don't have to like have that constant anxiety. So I feel like that plays into the AI stuff, like in terms of how we imagine the future of AI. It's either going to completely fail, or it's going to completely take over and like replace humanity. Or it's going to replace all graphic designers. I mean, it happens at all these different scales. It's going to replace journalists. It's going to replace, manufacturing jobs, taxi drivers, whatever. But it always ends up being sort of in the middle, which is, I think, just keeps feeding that same anxiety, which is sort of obviously like burning under the surface of our civilization at this point. But yeah, just to take a crack at the other question. I mean, I do agree with James that, as far as I can tell, AI requires like a gigantic amount of centralization to be effective. And the more it's centralized and the more it concentrates power, the more it is effective at doing what it does. Because you need those big data sets. And like, I think, Silicon Valley has sort of tricked us into handing over a lot of data by creating these very convenient, very responsive, user interfaces. So the UI basically feeds into the AI because that's how you get the data. Like Facebook and Google being the prime examples. Like you create something that's like very easy to use, very intuitive. It sort of feels intimate because when you use it, it sort of knows what you're about to do, and they're constantly tweaking around the edges. That even in subconscious ways, like you're sort of engaging with it more. Facebook has obviously turned into sort of a dystopian monster because of its lock-in, but Google continues to just create these like, wow, that's super convenient. It knows what I'm about to type, or it gives me suggestions, or it gives me intuitively customized search results based on my search history. Like, oh, it's so nice. It feels comfortable, and that is the thing that feeds their huge data set generating machine. And so it's really hard to imagine what that would look like if you nationalize Google or something. Are you going to continue to have this sort of manipulative, this sort of nexus of like manipulation and convenience that generates that data set? But I think if you look at other sectors, you'll see sort of other interesting sort of edge cases, like health, for example. Like I think James mentioned different data co-ops. Like there's a co-op called Savvy that basically has patients with like rare conditions or chronic conditions can basically keep their data and then pool it and then sell it to research companies so that they get the direct benefit financially of that stuff. So that's sort of an interesting edge case example. But obviously, health systems like the NHS in the UK are gathering these giant, like quite clean data sets, and of course, the private sector wants in on that. And so you have this interesting situation where you have this hugely valuable data set, which could generate all kinds of things, cures, new insights, new treatments, all kinds of things. But obviously the private sector, wants access to that data. And so watching the negotiation between sort of health systems and AI or machine learning driven companies, and the sort of outsourcing that happens, where it's like, because government hasn't invested in creating its own IT infrastructure, its own way, its own kind of institutions to service those, like all the information technology that happens in the health sector. And then of course those companies have a different interest. They want to use that lock-in to create new profit generating opportunities as opposed to serve the public. So I think that sort of intersection of the private IT contractors and public health services is especially in Canada, I guess. I don't know what the US must already be a total mess, but
ahead of that, I think
go ahead, sorry.
Actually was reading about synthetic data is a whole new topic here, but generating new data from existing data is a new hot topic. You're going to hear about that in the near future if you haven't already. But some startup has already, the U.S. Health, what's it called? National Institute of Health, I think. Anyways, is giving COVID-19 data to this startup so they can generate a model that can generate further data. So yeah, they're ahead of the game from Canada for sure, I think. Regarding Scott, about left accelerationism, that you mentioned, in generally, colleagues and I have written some critiques of this before, but generally accelerationism is so fascinated on the technology that they neglect the fact of revolution having to happen for what they want to, before the scenarios they're talking about can actually happen. There's that thing that leftists have been concerned about for a couple hundred years now, is their evolution, and dropping AI into the the world is not going to lead to the collapse of capitalism through full
Yeah.
automation. I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that's going to happen anymore. So I think that's the
Yeah.
problem with left accelerationism, and that's why I think that's why it basically died out, because
Hmm.
it was a moment of technological enthusiasm, abstracted from the perennial concerns of leftist thinking about material conditions and those having to change for a revolution or for a post-capitalist society.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that like left accelerationism as such is sort of beholden to this sort of speculating on technological revolution and sort of averse to prescribing any sort of social revolution or shift in social relations. That is like in a sense troubling, especially when there is such like an urgent need to just imagine radical global democracy to contest the power of these massive companies like Google that you say in your book is distinct by its sheer size, its diversified nature, its command of data, and also just this like massive investment in research. And the couple threads there I feel like I can pick up on lead me to kind of wonder about the role of the state, right? Like, one of the things that you're both kind of curious about clearly is like what role governments have in trying to, kind of claw back some of the monopolistic control that big tech has over these, socially transformative things, these technologies, right? Like, so, Drew, in your article, you say, like, despite spending billions to train a generation of AI experts and conduct the basic research that fuels the industry, governments have so far given away their ability to determine how technology is used. And like both of you have written about how, in fact, Canada is a country that's really keen on, like, historically, developing a national plan for AI. And yet, there isn't any within this, neoliberal model, any ability to imagine how to both build an AI market in the country, how to even do radical things like try to tackle climate change, but while still trying to maintain some control over that technology. That just seems anathema to the kind of operations of the neoliberal nation state. So like a lot of countries are following suit in terms of trying to build a national plan for AI. They're focusing on the cultivation of AI skilled labor, but they're and at the same time relaxing restrictions on data collection. What do you see as the sort of horizon for policy when it comes to like actually meeting the moment, accepting the challenge that there is this acceleration of AI technology? Like basically what does a national strategy on AI within a capitalist framework look like, and is there another more revolutionary model? I mean, certainly China's strategy in many ways is still operating within a like a very capitalist framework. Is another model possible within the logic of the contemporary nation state?
Well, this is an interesting topic to me because I'm Canadian, but I moved to Ireland last year for work, and
Hmm.
so I'm now in the EU context. And this is, there's a great example of this happening at the moment in the EU. They are trying to put into legislation what's called the AI Act, and this is going through the European Parliament, and it's supposed to be in its final draft, but it's being debated, quite rightfully by a lot of people because,
Hmm.
and if there's a saga going back a couple of years now, 2019, when the EU established the high-level expert group to sort of do the groundwork before they started on the actual building of the act. And there's an episode detailed by the German philosopher Thomas Metzinger in an article journalistic article he wrote about his experience being involved with that early group, and uh, him and some other people who are dubious of capital's influence over AI being good, wanted to have so-called red lines in the document about what should not be permitted at all, right? Certain things that shouldn't be permitted. And of course, that was not received well by the representatives of industry that were involved with that process. And it ended up being dropped, unsurprisingly, right?
Hmm.
So uh, we're watching in real time how this is a great test case for how AI policy is going to be formed.
Sure.
Um, And it's not going to be offensive to industry if precedent is correct. I mean, we'll see. I mean, industry is already very displeased in EU with the General Data Protection Regulation, which puts quite limits on what companies can do with data, and this will put further limits. And it's if you read the industry perspective, it's like it's going to destroy their business model. They're going to leave the country. They're going to leave the EU.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, coming back to the sort of centralization thing. I mean, I think governments are in this sort of race to the bottom framework. Certainly, Canada. I think putting over $1 billion into AI research and educating basically AI hub like clusters of people who can do AI stuff for companies.
They all move to the US anyways.
Yeah, exactly. But they're just plowing money into it, trying to create this. Basically, yeah, just trying to create these poles of to attract investment. Basically, I mean, I think that's more or less the thing. But I think starting with places where we actually already have control over the data sets, like health, would be an interesting place to start and say, okay, we're going to start building institutions around this and treat it as a commons rather than, if you look at the sort of open source model where it's like instead of having one company have proprietary control over an operating system, for example, if that operating system is open source, then the business model that basically happens is it's like a lake. It's like there's different villages that sort of set up around the lake. Everybody uses it. Everybody has an interest in managing it in the public interest. And they also derive economic benefit from it. They can feed themselves. They can create industries. They can, set up marinas, tourism, whatever. So basically it's the same thing with, you could imagine the same thing with AI where you have a data set that's like managed in the public interest. And there are, like, as James said, red lines around how it can be used. But then, and you have to be licensed to whatever degree by some kind of public oversight body that charged with enforcing those things to have access to it, or you can only have access to a certain facet of it, where you create public institutions that help people understand what data is out there, control who has access to what, and ideally be able to delete some of it too if they want to. But then also create a public policy around collective access to that data. So it's like, oh, we're going to give this nonprofit health research institute access to this data so they can come up with a better cure for cancer. Mm-hmm. and then maybe we'll and then of course it's up to us to say, like, okay, well, like, who is going to benefit from that? Are we just going to sell that off to the pharma companies and have them make profit off of it, or can we find maybe create another public institution that we have to start building power somewhere, and I don't think it's straightforward where it's going to happen. I think but I think what is very clear is that AI is accelerating and entrenching and consolidating corporate power and the power of capital. Mm-hmm. So we have to start creating a different model somewhere. And so I think any kind of win that we can find in any kind of sector where we can say, this is a different way of doing it, and here's a community of practice for how to do that and how to do it well, and not have it be this dystopian, scary thing where the government is accessing all your data and you don't know what's going on. But mm-hmm. it's something else. It actually has some kind of democratic legitimacy to it. Then I think that's the place to build from.
And what the Canadian government's doing is exactly not that. By making these innovation hubs and encouraging them to be subject to market dynamics, all you do is train people, give them a lot of money and resources for a couple years so that they can either get bought out by one of the giants, which are all in the States. We don't have them in Canada. We don't have native tech giants. So, all the money, the highest level paying jobs in AI are in those 4 or 5 companies from the States, right? And mm-hmm. either get bought out or you just get headhunted to go work there if you produce something very cutting edge in one of Canada's AI hubs. Or you even get headhunted by American University, which pays 3 times the salary or something, right? So it's I mean, there's people all over the political spectrum critiquing the Canadian government's approach to this, because it basically doesn't work from any level or any political stance. It's not working, right? It
Mhm.
is not generating AI progress for Canada. I mean, the whole history of deep learning. I don't know if you guys know, like Jeff Hinton was a longtime researcher at CFAR in Toronto, Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and basically he's the guy who came up with the paradigm of deep learning that the modern AI industry is based on. And shortly after coming up with that, and it became known, and while he was based in CFAR, he was taken to Google, and
Mhm.
all of his grad students who he was working with, which spun off companies from their research and stuff, all of them are employed by big tech. All of their companies have been bought by big tech. So from the very starting of this AI era, Canada has not been benefiting from AI.
Right.
And I think you could imagine just one little comment, but I think you could imagine a situation where Canada, started to treat some of the data sets that it has, which are quite, I think some of which are quite rich, as a commons, and started to build a sort of nonprofit or more cooperatively minded infrastructure around that, where the commons is managed in the public interest, and then the companies get sort of perched around it, maybe making some profit, but not having control of the thing that generates the value. I think if you did that, then you could imagine Canada being more successful in what are ultimately its economic goals, which are to create jobs and keep people who are interested in AI in Canada. Because at least then you could attract people who are interested in doing, and not sort of feeding this dystopian machine, but instead maybe taking a pay cut, but coming and working on something that actually has a chance of benefiting the public.
Yeah, I mean, so many things there, right? Like, it feels as though we're kind of narrating a struggle over sovereignty in a sense, but I like that we're, like trying to focus on specific sectors and the question of who benefits as a means of sort of reclaiming accountability from a increasingly monopolistic system where, like, as Ben Tarnoff says, these companies like Uber and Amazon and Google are basically sovereigns. They operate like sovereigns. This is why, like, in James's work, it's all about like autonomy, like how automation erodes autonomy. I think like this has to do with just the kind of centrality of secrecy to algorithmic knowledge production, like a culture of secrecy. One of the things that I think is valuable about the writing that you're both doing is that it is sort of about exposing in a way, like mapping the secret of who is around that lake, like who is grouped around that lake. In your book, Automation and Autonomy, you talk about like the 5 types of entities that are basically involved in the enclosure of that lake. You've got number 1, big tech. Number 2, these industrial dinosaurs like GE and others. You've got this startup horde, right? More than 450 startups working on AI, I think, according to CNBC, in just the US alone, maybe more. And then think tanks and research labs. And then in fifth place, you've got state actors, right? So actual sovereigns, let's say, politically, are a distant fifth in terms of trying to actually reap the benefits, basically, of what data can help us glean about, potential ways of improving social life, right? It's just obviously not a priority. And so, I wanted to ask, I guess, about work, right? Like the specific sector of like labor, which is, very often foregrounded in debates over AI and automation. Like, it's a genuine fear. We've kind of touched on it a few times, but I think it's worth, reiterating the fact that there is work, for example, being done by data scientists, the people creating the visible AI commodities that earn so much hype. There's a sense that there's now a massive demand for labor with AI skills. James, your research is based on interviews with some of these people. And I just feel like there is like a level of mystery about the kind of work that they're doing. You actually underscore the fact that like it's mysterious often to the workers themselves what they're doing. At one point, you say that the belief that machine learning is a, quote, occult technology produced by occult means is widely held. So people in the business of producing artificial intelligence are talking about how they're doing it by like almost intuition. So basically, like I'm wondering how we demystify it. Like if the practice of producing AI-based commodities is itself intuitive, this kind of occult technology, then does that like open up a space of intervention where we can actually demand that AI be devoted to more socially just ends rather than just like marketing or policing or military technology?
Well, I mean, part of that occulted nature is simply due to the fact that it's a new practice, right? And it
Right.
hasn't been, best practices haven't been codified yet. And the industry is actually working on that. So software development was also sort of like this in its early days, and it now is largely codified in what they call DevOps. And ML ops is a new thing in the work. Machine learning ops is a new thing in the works, as people within the industry try to like standardize and codify the labor processes here. So that's one factor, and another
Hmm.
factor comes from the technology itself. Like I was trying to get at earlier, the fact that the emergent property nature of machine learning, that it emerges from the data in a sense, that adds an extra layer of sort of unknowability, right? Because you
Hmm.
don't know in advance what's going to be the best way to get something that works out of the data you have. So
Hmm.
some of it seems to be inherent to the particular task at hand. That being said, the internal stuff is kind of what I'm really interested in, because I like to see how it's evolving endogenously. But I think it lines up actually conveniently. The standardization movement that's going on inside actually lines up with uh, the requests from outside agencies, communities, and stakeholders like us, who want more uh, understanding of what's going on with these systems and how they're designed. There's actually alignment of interest for the moment right now, which I don't know how long that will last, but it's probably
Hmm.
worth working together for the moment on that, if that's possible.
I mean, that might be a good place to leave things, right? This kind of open ended feeling of what resembles hope, or at least a kind of wonder or a sense of like possibility. But I did want to ask about, this is to the question a little bit of hype, but in relationship to like the collective imagination around AI, right? This seems to be a kind of lever we can pull to a certain extent. So like, there are documentaries about AI that try and lay bare what it is that it's built out of. Those documentaries, I think you've pointed out in the book that you co-authored, Inhuman Power, tend to be a little bit naive in terms of like championing machine learning's possibilities while also disguising corporate investments in the technology. But there is something aspirational about the idea of computing reaching this emergent level of a kind of unanticipated performance mastery. Like it captures the imagination, right? For an AI generated performance beating some like master of the game Go, or like chess has been this ongoing fascination. So like those are stories that do capture the public's imagination. In the book Inhuman Power, there's also this like, I think, refreshing kind of take on fictional explorations of AI, right? Like I think it's easy in some ways to just like condemn all of them, to look at like, a film like Ex Machina or Blade Runner as like, useless or something, exterior to the conversation. But like in that book, you're actually saying that these narratives of a kind of technological singularity are important as thought experiments. And I know that like you're gesturing to the Terminator series of films in Automation and Autonomy. I'm just curious what both of you think about this. Like, what role do you feel maybe films that depict our relationship to AI have? Maybe, I don't know, like, what are some of your favorites? Is it 2001? Is it The Matrix? Do you like Westworld? Do you think it went off the rails to a certain extent? Um, any thoughts on pop cultural representations of AI and what sort of work they do?
I definitely think that we should think about AI uniquely through the lens of Arnold Schwarzenegger versus Robert Patrick. I'm just imagining a meme where like
I actually agree 100%.
where collect. There's a meme where like or I'm imagining a meme where like Arnold is like, "Come with me if you want to live," and it's like, and that's like cooperativized AI basically.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, but then in that movie, the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator, sort of reprogrammed Terminator, is basically there to help them destroy the possibility of artificial intelligence in the future. So, I'm sort of torn, honestly, between the two, and I think the ambiguity there of is really well captured in that movie, and honestly, it's disappointing that James Cameron is one of the very few who's actually done something that has that sort of lasting resonance and it creates a sort of a moment to think in a complex but starkly human way about the implications of what we're up to. But of course, Skynet already exists in the form of like capital. Like capital isn't human. Any human that doesn't serve the interests of capital of replicating itself gets spit out, and so it's already sort of subordinated and some of the best and brightest layers of humanity to its sort of brutal regime that is obviously leading to our demise at the moment. Certainly that's the straight line extrapolation. So yeah.
I mean, as funny as it is, I mean, I do think Terminator 2 is one of the key fictional references for AI. I mean, you have the basic principle that gets repeated a lot now, of course, that the Terminators are the product of an AI that's not embodied. That's like a program AI, right? Some thing that then creates the machine warriors to do its bidding, and is a creation of a defense contractor in the U.S., right? Which is, pretty plausible, I guess, as far as origin stories go. And I don't know if you get this out of Inhuman Power or not, but we pull on it a bit there. But Nick Land, this former academic philosopher that was at Warwick in the UK and is now one of the major ideologues for the alt-right. Before he turned to the alt-right, he was a sort of Deleuzian theorist of capitalism, cybernetic capitalism, and wrote some very interesting, weird fiction/theory essays in the 90s that are pretty influential on us in writing Inhuman Power, to be honest. There's Meltdown and Circuitries are two essays that he wrote in the 90s. And he uses Terminator as well as William Gibson's Neuromancer, which is, I think, the other key fictional reference on AI, for me anyways. It's a novel, cyberpunk novel. And he uses those two things to think about capitalism and machines and how they interact. And he's sort of like on the side of capitalism, which is the weird thing about him. He says something like, capitalism is a machine is sent back from the future, building itself out of the resources that exist in the present. And it's a reference to the, of course, the Terminator being sent back from the future to kill John Connor before he can, lead the revolution in the future, right? So it's this strange anti-revolutionary, pro-capitalist version of capital as an AI, right? That's the equation basically that he makes, is that capital is an AI that's not quite achieved intelligence yet. So I find that, even while being a critic of an opponent of capitalism, his theorization there is pretty evocative and draws on the what I see to be the key fictional text.
Yeah, no, and I mean, like, we could talk at length, I think, about like the various pop cultural representations of like our relationship to AI and what they do and don't do, how they're simplistic and complex. But I think like I won't take any more of your time. I think it's been really helpful for me to be able to talk through some of these problems that, we really do run into issues of like coming up against the problem of projection and the emergence of these kinds of these forms of inhuman power that may have a shaping force. But I like this kind of idea that in some sense, like, capitalism is the inhuman power that feels as though it's been sent from some dystopian future to sort of, determine the parameters of what's possible today. But I think there's a kind of kernel of something like sort of liberatory in trying to center on sectors where, we can, I don't know, like gain a certain amount of traction in triggering the public's imagination about like what this technology can do in a positive sense beyond just like profit generation, or beyond, play is important, but also beyond just mere play. Because like these, a book like Kate Crawford's Atlas of AI makes it clear that closely guarded secrets within big tech can have big implications if nobody's watching, right? So anyway, all that to say, I'm really appreciative that you could connect today and that we could have this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciated the conversation. Thanks, Scott.